When justice misfires, a stunning courtroom revelation. The courtroom buzzes with muted chatter, a faint hum of anticipation rippling through the benches. The defendant, a middle-aged black man, stands at the center of the room. His hands don't tremble, his gaze steady, a defiant calm despite the weight of what looms ahead. He is dressed impeccably in a sharp gray suit, but his composed demeanor only draws whispered judgment from a room that misreads confidence as arrogance. At the bench, Judge Martin Greaves sits rigid, his gavel positioned close to his hand. Renowned for his unyielding approach to the letter of the law, what makes him infamous are the statistics, numbers woven through public discourse about his disproportionately long sentences for African American defendants. His clipped tone and sharp gestures carve a distinction between authority and humanity, one he rarely crosses. This case, though seemingly standard for his courtroom, hides an unsettling complexity. The accused is charged with obstruction of justice, documents shredded, evidence manipulated. The prosecution paints him as a dirty cog in a corrupt wheel. His status as a figure of authority only solidifies the narrative, they argue, of betrayal against the very nation he is sworn to serve. The gallery is filled with curious onlookers, families, reporters, and activists clutching notebooks. In the corner, a young law clerk scribbles on a yellow pad, though his movements lack conviction, as if distracted by the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The prosecutor proceeds with his closing argument. "This man," he bellows, gesturing at the defendant, "has sown distrust in our system, proving himself unworthy of the power he once held. We cannot forgive such a betrayal, a man turning against the very justice that protects us all." His words crash against the walls of the room, amplified by his theatrical delivery. Nod in agreement. Others exchange glances, weighing the words carefully. The defendant, however, remains unmoved. Judge Greaves finally clears his throat, his voice slicing through the tension as he begins, "After hearing the facts presented and arguments made, I have reached a decision." All eyes fixate on him, the air now so charged it feels alive. He reaches for the piece of paper in front of him. His hands are steady, a performance of objectivity. The court finds the defendant guilty, sentencing him to 20 years in federal prison, he announces, drawing sharp breaths from the gallery. Shockwaves pulse through the room. 20 years for an act of this nature? A sentence harsher than sentences for violent crimes. Low murmurs swell into chaotic whispers as even the most dispassionate observers show signs of disbelief. The defendant, however, does not flinch. As though he was prepared for this, his demeanor remains a mystery that unnerves even the most confident in the gallery. The bailiff approaches him. That's when the man speaks, a rich, firm voice filling the courtroom for the first time since proceedings began. "Your Honor," he says with surgical precision, stopping everyone in their tracks. His refusal to bow in defeat holds gravity, a magnetic force pulling every ear toward him. "Before I comply with this court's order, I believe there's something the court, more specifically, you should know." His cryptic comment forces Judge Greaves's attention. A visible flicker crosses the judge's face, irritation mingled with curiosity, though he proceeds with caution. "This court has ruled," the judge warns. "You are out of line, sir." The defendant ignores the implied threat and raises his hand instead. From his jacket pocket, he produces an ID card in a slow, deliberate motion, holding it for the room to see. Gasps ripple. No longer whispers now. The gallery erupts with an uncontrollable reaction, reporters leaping to their feet in disbelief, their pens suddenly flying faster across paper. The air thrums with startled energy. Shouts of shock are muffled by the realization hitting every corner of the room. The words on the card gleam under the fluorescent lights. United States Attorney General. Judge Greaves' expression freezes. His stern composure cracks ever so slightly, betraying emotions that he cannot fully suppress. Shock, alarm, guilt? His gavel remains motionless as he stares, realization dawning painfully slow. For a moment, time seems suspended, the weight of the implications crashing onto everyone present. The defendant, no, the U.S. Attorney General, finally addresses not just the judge, but the entire courtroom. "You sentenced me, just like you sentenced countless others, not for my actions, but for who you think I am." His words are soft yet devastating, the accusation rippling with truth deeper than the confines of this single trial. Around the courtroom, there's palpable uncertainty. Murmurs swell as journalists begin piecing together a narrative far more scandalous than they anticipated. Judge Greaves stares at the man before him, his cold demeanor crumbling in stages. But before anyone can react further, the sound of a phone buzzes, sharp and intrusive, cutting through the stunned silence. Someone answers, their face immediately tight with urgency. They whisper something to an aide who hurries out of the courtroom. Whatever storm is brewing outside is bound to find its way through these doors. The defendant catches it all. He meets the judge's eyes one final time and utters, "This isn't over." The courtroom sits in a suspended silence that stretches for what feels like an eternity. Reporters exchange frantic glances, their pens hovering mid-air, unsure whether to jot down the confession that just shifted the ground underneath their feet or to keep their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. Judge Greaves remains seated, his posture more rigid than before, as though stiffened by the shock of his own judgment unraveling before him. The dark wood walls, lined with degrees of authority and justice, now feel like an audience themselves, bearing witness to an ordeal inching toward the extraordinary. The United States Attorney General, once stripped of his humanity in the court's eyes, folds his ID card back into his pocket with the same deliberate care he used to reveal it. His gaze, sharp and calculated, sweeps across the room like an unspoken dialogue with every person seated there. He's suddenly larger than life, no longer an accused man, but a symbol of a shifting tide. Judge Greaves exhales sharply, his measured authority giving way to visible cracks. "You're overstepping," he begins, though the usual weight of his voice sounds diminished. "This court operates independently of politics and social standing. Your title does not grant immunity from the law." A murmur rises from the gallery, some leaning forward as though proximity might bring clarity to this murky revelation, but the defendant, no, the Attorney General, remains undeterred. "You've misjudged me," he says, his tone steady as a metronome, yet carrying an undercurrent of righteous fury. "But you also misjudged justice itself. Look around this room, count the faces here who've braced themselves for inequity before you even opened your mouth. What does that say about the system you claim to uphold?" The judge tightens his grip on the edges of his bench, words poised but uncertain. "This is not a political rally," he snaps, his voice rising an octave to mask his inner turmoil. "Stand down, or I'll have the bailiff remove you from the premises." "That would be your second mistake today," the Attorney General counters coolly, eyes locked on the judge. The room collectively holds its breath for his next words. "You were ready to bury me with a 20-year sentence for an imagined crime. You never believed I could be innocent, not because of the evidence or the law, but because I don't fit your image of integrity, and you know exactly why." With that, a heavy dread settles over the room, bearing down like a storm cloud. The accusations are no longer confined to one man's plight. They ripple outward, challenging the broader system. Judge Greaves's face darkens, but before he can retort, the sound of hurried footsteps echoes from outside the courtroom. The doors burst open and a young woman, her auburn hair pulled back into a neat bun, rushes in, her badge clipped to the edge of her blazer. "Your Honor," she says breathlessly, running toward the bench and holding out a folder. Her interruption is so unorthodox that even the bailiff doesn't stop her. "There's been a development." Judge Greaves's eyes narrow as he accepts the file and flips through its contents. His brow furrows deeper with each page. The gallery cranes to catch any snippet of insight. The whispers return, a low drone of collective suspicion and anticipation. Whatever is in that folder, it's more than the judge was prepared for. The Attorney General watches him carefully, his expression sharp but controlled. His patience is like a tightly coiled spring, ready but measured. "I believe that contains documentation from my personal investigations," he says, breaking the silence. "Evidence that was conveniently withheld during my trial. Ironic, isn't it? The very obstruction of justice I was accused of turns out to be a tool wielded against me." The judge's hand halts mid-turn on a page. His jaw sets and his eyes flicker toward the Attorney General. The room waits for his next move, the collective air growing impossibly tense. "This court will recess for—" "No!" the Attorney General interrupts sharply. The single word reverberates like the crack of a whip. "No more recesses, no more delays. If you can hand down a 20-year sentence in under 5 minutes, surely you can recognize the truth in the time it takes to read those pages. Or is this courtroom only efficient when it's punishing people like me?" The heart of the room beats violently, a rhythm dictated by the unflinching honesty of the man standing at its center. The gallery, once a restless audience, now seems utterly transfixed. Even the prosecutor, once brimming with confidence, sits deflated, his pen still as he avoids eye contact. Judge Greaves is visibly battling the weight of the moment. For a man who thrives on the clarity of black and white rulings, the shades of gray in this case seem almost unbearable. "This is highly irregular," he manages to mutter. "Irregular is sentencing an innocent man to 20 years in prison," the Attorney General fires back. "Irregular is having a courtroom more interested in my defiance than in the truth." His voice crescendos before softening once more. "You think I wanted to stand here today, accused and condemned? I didn't. But I will not let the truth be buried, not for me and not for anyone else in this room." Before Judge Greaves can recover from the onslaught of words, another interruption pierces the scene. A security guard enters with a whispered message to the judge. Whatever is said visibly rattles the stoic man behind the bench. His lips tighten and his gaze sweeps across the courtroom briefly before settling back on the defendant. "We have a problem," the judge declares at last, though his words are as much an admission as they are an order, and for the first time there's a faint glimmer of uncertainty in his usually commanding tone. An external one. The Attorney General doesn't flinch. His eyes remain fixed on the man who had nearly decided his fate. "Then perhaps you'll realize," he says with quiet intensity, "that this isn't just about me anymore. The problem isn't external. It's been sitting here all along." The courtroom air hangs heavy with a curious, almost palpable tension, like the prelude to an oncoming storm. All eyes remain fixated on Judge Martin Greaves, who barely conceals the turmoil reflected in his stormy expression. The once commanding presence behind the bench now looks dwarfed by the storm of revelations engulfing the room. For the first time in his 20-year career, the facade of control he meticulously cultivated appears paper-thin. Seconds tick by, each one dragging with excruciating weight. The bailiff, usually a stoic figure, keeps glancing at the Attorney General as though caught between his duty and the sense that something extraordinary is unfolding. The gallery, a sea of faces painted with incredulity and suspicion, seems frozen in place, their collective breath held as if releasing it will shatter the fragile moment. The Attorney General, his sharp gray suit now a stark contrast to the crumbling composure of the judge, stands rooted but commanding, a figure both defiant and resolute. His gaze locks onto Judge Greaves, refusing to waver. The tension between the two men grows tighter, as if the very air between them might snap. When Judge Greaves finally speaks, his voice is quieter, almost strained, yet still laced with the authority he clutches onto like a lifeline. "This development," he says, gesturing vaguely toward the folder in his hand, "does not excuse your actions or diminish the charges brought against you." The Attorney General's lips curl into a faint, calculated smile, but it holds no mirth. "You mean the charges based on fabricated evidence?" he replies, his tone sharp, piercing through the judge's weak attempt at deflection. "If that folder holds what I believe it does, then the entire foundation of this case against me is rotten." Judge Greaves flinches ever so slightly at the accusation, though he masks it poorly behind a cough. "This court will examine the contents," he announces, his grip tightening on the file. "Until then, any further interruptions from you? Will you hold me in contempt?" The Attorney General interrupts dryly, his voice cutting through the judge's like a blade. "Wouldn't that be poetic? Condemning me for the corruption you yourself enabled? Tell me, Judge Greaves, how many other lives have you sentenced without due consideration? How many others have you written off before they stepped foot into your courtroom?" His voice isn't shouting, yet it resonates cool, precise, and unrelenting. Gasps ripple through the gallery at the boldness of his words. A reporter near the front scribbles furiously, barely able to keep up. Others in the room lean forward, captivated, as though the weight of their collective focus could somehow influence what might happen next. Before Judge Greaves can respond, a commotion erupts near the back of the courtroom. A door creaks open and another officer rushes in, this time carrying urgency in his hurried steps. His whispered exchange with another member of the legal staff draws questioning looks from the gallery. Whatever is being shared is serious enough to stop the officer in his tracks, his face pale and his eyes darting nervously toward the front of the room. The judge snaps his gaze toward the commotion, his irritation rising. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" he demands, his voice rising slightly, hoping to reassert some semblance of control over the proceedings. But the officer hesitates. It takes him 3 long steps and an apologetic glance at the Attorney General before he leans in close to Judge Greaves, whispering words that nobody else can hear. The judge's face turns an alarming shade paler, his knuckles whiten as he grips the bench. Whatever he's just been told rattles him visibly. For one fleeting moment, Greaves looks like a man on the verge of losing everything. The Attorney General speaks, breaking the uneasy silence stretching through the court once again. "Something wrong, Your Honor?" His tone drips with a blend of cutting sarcasm and genuine curiosity. "Sounds like the truth is catching up to you faster than you expected." Judge Greaves swallows hard and straightens his shoulders, though whatever veneer of infallibility he once possessed has clearly begun to crack under the relentless pressure. The gallery is now abuzz with speculation, their whispers loud enough to create a low hum through the room. Finally, Greaves slams his gavel down, though the act feels performative rather than commanding. "This court is in recess for 20 minutes, he announces, his voice tight and strained. "When we reconvene, the matters at hand will be addressed with due course." "Oh no, we won't," the Attorney General interjects sharply, his voice rising just above the gavel's echo. The room falls silent, stunned by his refusal to allow the proceedings to temporarily pause. Every time this court takes a break, more lies are buried, more time is bought to twist the narrative. No more delays, not when you've already sentenced me to 20 years without pause. Judge Greaves freezes mid-motion, his gavel hovering just inches above the bench. The Attorney General continues with a magnetic intensity that draws every set of eyes back to him. "You don't get to sweep this under the rug knot anymore. You have evidence before you that could exonerate me. That points to negligence, or worse within this very courtroom's proceedings. If you let this case slip through the cracks, you're complicit." The judge opens his mouth to respond, but the words falter before they come. The room is silent but for the soft scratching of pens against paper, reporters eagerly documenting the unprecedented standoff they've found themselves witness to. And then, from somewhere within the courthouse, a loud, echoing metallic bang reverberates through the walls, a sound that immediately silences even the whispers in the gallery. Gasps ripple throughout the room as everyone instinctively turns toward the door, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright fear. The Attorney General's eyes narrow as he watches the judge carefully, his reaction or lack thereof speaking volumes. "I told you," he says softly, though his words carry the weight of an earthquake. "This isn't over." The courtroom trembles on an invisible fault line, the tension mounting with every passing second. Judge Greaves, though still physically commanding the bench, seems emotionally dwarfed by the enormity of what's unraveling before him. His gavel sits untouched, no longer wielded as the weapon of authority it once was. The walls, carved with majestic details meant to inspire respect for justice, now seem like mocking witnesses to an institution teetering on the edge of exposure. The Attorney General doesn't move from where he stands, broad-shouldered and defiant. His presence dominates the room in a way that is not physical but existential. He is not just another defendant, not just another life being processed through the machinery of a broken system. Right now he is a mirror, and everyone in the courtroom is being forced to look at themselves and their assumptions more deeply than they had ever anticipated. "Let me ask you something, Your Honor," the Attorney General says suddenly, his tone formal but searing. His words seem to slice through the fragile silence, making every spectator in the room lean slightly forward. "What's it like knowing that for countless years you've wielded this gavel?" He gestures subtly towards the judge's hand. "Not to deliver impartiality, but to reinforce inequity masked as law?" The judge stiffens, his jaw tightening visibly. There's a flutter of motion from the prosecuting attorney, who appears ready to leap to the defense of the bench. However, a single gesture from Judge Greaves halts him. Whether out of pride, arrogance, or a desire to fully control the narrative, Greaves clearly doesn't want aid. "Not yet. You stand accused here, not the court," Judge Greaves retorts, his voice regaining some of its usual authoritative cadence, though there's a tremor at its edge. "You would do well to remember where you stand." "I remember exactly where I stand," the Attorney General answers. His voice doesn't rise, but its resonance fills the cavernous courtroom. "I stand in the same place too many others like me have stood in a room where my worth has been decided before the trial even began." A series of audible gasps ripple through the audience. It's a bold statement, the kind that transcends the confines of this single case. Activists seated in the gallery nod unconsciously, their faces marked by a mix of vindication and indignation at the public airing of an uncomfortable truth. The door to the courtroom creaks open again, the sound unnervingly loud in the charged stillness. Another court officer, his face pale and his demeanor shaken, steps inside and quickly approaches Judge Greaves. He leans in, whispers something brief and inaudible to the rest of the room, and then retreats as quickly as he came. Judge Greaves's face falters, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. Whatever he's just been told has clearly unsettled him further. His eyes dart across the room for the briefest of moments, landing on the Attorney General, then moving toward the gallery filled with onlookers, reporters, and what now feels like history's judgment. Something is happening outside these walls. Something big, and Judge Greaves knows it. But the Attorney General's voice reclaims the room's attention before anyone else can process the judge's shift in demeanor. "It must really sting," he continues, his voice quieter now but no less impactful. "Because deep down you know this case stopped being about me the moment I revealed who I am. You didn't sentence me because of a law I supposedly broke. You sentenced me because the sight of someone like me holding the kind of power I had, power you couldn't control, was unbearable to you." The words ignite sparks across the courtroom. The gallery buzzes with emotions, shock, outrage, agreement, disbelief, all swirling together in a chaotic symphony of human response. One reporter can't scribble fast enough, his hand a blur as he scrawls across his notepad. "Order," Judge Greaves demands, slamming the gavel with more force than necessary. The wooden handle cracks against the dense surface of his desk, and for a fleeting moment, the sound dominates the room. Order is neither restored nor expected. The seismic waves of this confrontation won't be stilled by a mere piece of wood. The prosecutor chooses this moment to stand, perhaps believing the moment ripe for returning control to the court's favor. "Your Honor," he begins, his voice feigning calm, "with all due respect, this circus cannot be allowed to continue. This courtroom is a venue for law and justice, not baseless accusations against its integrity." The Attorney General, ever poised, doesn't let the statement linger. "Exactly," he replies, cutting through the prosecutor's words like a scalpel. "Which is why we're here talking about integrity or lack thereof." Before the prosecutor can respond, an alert buzzes sharply from the front of the room. This time, it's a bulky conference phone atop the judge's desk. All eyes shift, and the judge hesitates, visibly considering whether to answer in front of the courtroom. "Judge Greaves!" The deep voice from the phone speaker calls out before the receiver is even lifted. The tone suggests authority, tinged with controlled urgency. "We need to speak immediately." The judge's fingers hover just above the phone's buttons, his free hand trembling slightly beside the folder containing the explosive evidence against the Attorney General. His hesitation doesn't go unnoticed. The courtroom can almost taste the uncertainty radiating from him. "Put it on speaker," the Attorney General suggests, his tone deceptively calm. The audacity of his request stuns everyone into silence, their collective gaze shifting back to the bench with electrified anticipation. Judge Greaves lifts his head, his glare sharp as a blade aimed at the Attorney General. But something in the weight of the moment, or perhaps the gravity of the unseen forces pressing in from outside, forces him to comply. With the press of a button, the courtroom is exposed to the voice on the other end of the line. "The national press has just caught wind," the voice informs tersely. "There's no containing this anymore." The cliffhanger strikes like a lightning bolt. The room is frozen in the disbelief, every mind racing towards the implications of what they've just heard. Outside forces are now seeping into the core of the courtroom's drama, and the game has changed once again. Judge Martin Greaves sits at the bench, outwardly composed, yet his fingers tremble ever so slightly as they hover over the speakerphone button. Every set of eyes in the courtroom is riveted on him, the tension and almost physical weight pressing against the walls. The voice coming through the phone, a voice of undeniable authority, has just announced that the case is no longer contained, and the realization of it is rapidly settling over the room. For a moment, Greaves hesitates. His hesitation is brief, but in this charged atmosphere it's noticeable. Finally, with one deliberate motion, he presses the speakerphone button. The faint static clears, and the voice speaks again. "This court needs to act quickly," the caller states firmly. "The press conference is already forming outside the courthouse. A statement will be required." The Attorney General doesn't flinch, his gaze fixed on the trembling hands of the judge. "A statement won't save you," he says coldly, addressing the judge directly. His words slice through the tension like a scalpel, drawing faint murmurs from the gallery. The courtroom is on edge, the spectators unsure whether the judge will respond to the unseen caller or take control of the situation himself. Greaves's knuckles tighten against the edge of the bench, and when he finally speaks, his voice is taut. "This is my courtroom," he announces, though even he can't fully hide the tremor in his tone. "I will dictate how we proceed." The Attorney General lifts an eyebrow, his composure unshaken. "That's the problem, Your Honor," he says, his voice deliberate and steady. "You've always dictated. You've never listened." Gasps ripple through the gallery, and the judge briefly loses his veneer of composure, his glare slicing toward the Attorney General. Before he can react further, the voice on the speakerphone cuts back in, its tone demanding immediate attention. "Judge Greaves, a secondary issue has arisen." The call continues. Federal investigators are en route to the courtroom. They've been briefed on the new evidence regarding the defendant's case. There's a heavy pause before the voice adds, "With a weight of authority that cannot be ignored, they'll need your cooperation." Greaves's face flushes, his control over the courtroom slipping away one grain at a time. The movement in the gallery is growing no restless whispers, shifting bodies, a collective hum of disbelief and speculation. It's clear that whatever control he thought he had over this trial is evaporating by the second. And then, in a voice calm but deadly, the Attorney General speaks again. "Looks like the system you're so determined to protect is finally turning its gaze inward," he says. His words aren't loud, but the hush that falls over the courtroom makes them feel amplified. How poetic. The judge's fist lands sharply on the wooden bench, a rare display of emotion from a man so tightly wound. "Enough!" he barks, his tone rising, but the words don't land with the force he intends. The whispers don't cease, nor do the piercing stares directed at him from every corner of the room. The Attorney General doesn't back down. He tilts his head slightly, evaluating the man before him with an intensity that unnerves even the most objective spectators. "You can yell at me all you want," he says plainly, the faintest hint of a challenge underlying his words. "But it won't change the fact that this courtroom is no longer under your control." At that moment, the courtroom doors open once again. This time, the figures that enter bring an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. Two federal agents in sharp suits stride in, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. The gallery falls silent, the soft creak of the door closing behind them the only sound. They make their way toward the bench without hesitation, their faces unreadable masks of professionalism. One of them, a tall man with a crisp demeanor, steps forward and addresses the judge directly. "Your Honor," he says, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of authority, "we need access to all evidence related to this trial immediately. This includes the folder you've just been given." The judge stiffens, his jaw tightening as he meets the agent's unwavering gaze. For a moment, it looks as though he might refuse, might insist on his authority as the presiding judge in this courtroom. But the weight of the moment, of the eyes watching him, of the crumbling facade of his control presses down on him visibly. Reluctantly, almost angrily, he picks up the folder from his desk. His hands betray him slightly, trembling as he passes it across the bench to the waiting agent. The tall man accepts it without a word, stepping back to join his colleague as they open the folder and begin flipping through its contents. The Attorney General watches the exchange carefully, his expression unreadable but his body language poised, as though ready for whatever might come next. Across the gallery, the spectators seem frozen, their attention split between the agents and the expressions playing across the faces of the judge and defendant. "Do you feel it yet, Your Honor?" the Attorney General asks quietly, his voice cutting through the silence once again. The tide turning? The weight of accountability finally catching up to this room? Judge Greaves says nothing, but the tightness in his jaw and the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead speak volumes. He looks toward the agents, as though searching for an escape route, but finds none. One of the agents looks up from the folder, his expression neutral but his words carrying a gravity that ripples through the room. "This evidence raises serious questions, Judge," he says plainly, his tone professional but firm. "Questions that will need to be answered by everyone involved in this case." The gallery erupts in whispers once more, a chaotic hum of speculation and disbelief surging through the room. But the Attorney General stays silent, his focus trained on the man behind the bench. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper but undeniably heard, the Attorney General delivers one final line. "This is just the beginning." The atmosphere inside the courtroom feels electrical, most volatile, as thick as a thunderstorm about to erupt. Every eye in the gallery, from the reporters scratching away at their notebooks to the activists perched on the edge of their seats, is trained on what's unfolding at the center of this legal tempest. The presence of the two federal agents, now standing near the judge's bench with their sharp suits and cool demeanor, has shifted the tone of the room. They are a silent but menacing reminder that this isn't just about a single trial anymore. A chain reaction has begun, and no one in this room can predict where it will end. Judge Greaves, gripping the edge of his bench in an attempt to anchor himself, stares at the folder the agents are meticulously reviewing. His usually confident and commanding demeanor has transformed into something more precarious. He knows that the case he had under control just hours ago is now slipping rapidly through his fingers, spiraling into chaos. His glances toward the Attorney General have become more frequent but just as fleeting, as though looking too long might concede a point he refuses to acknowledge. The Attorney General, meanwhile, appears untouched by the whirlwind of events unraveling around him. He stands tall, poised, his calm defiance an unspoken challenge to the authority of this room. His eyes remain focused on the judge, unyielding in their intensity, his presence a stark counterpoint to the growing uncertainty saturating the courtroom. He speaks, finally breaking the silence with words that ripple through the air like thunder. "It's not a good feeling, is it, Your Honor?" His voice is measured, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to wielding words like precision tools. When the framework you've built starts to collapse under its own weight, when the truth claws its way to the surface, no matter how deep you've tried to bury it. Judge Greaves stiffens, his expression faltering before he summons his usual clipped tone. "This is still my courtroom." He fixes the defendant with a glare meant to re-establish his authority, but the effect is hollow. The Attorney General meets his eyes unapologetically, unflinching. One of the federal agents interrupts, his calm voice slicing through the tension. "Your Honor, this evidence doesn't just raise questions about the charges against the Attorney General. It also implicates multiple parties involved in the investigation and prosecution of this case." His words hang in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. A murmur ripples through the gallery, a growing hum of speculation that's impossible to ignore. Judge Greaves tightens his grip on the bench, his knuckles whitening. "You're suggesting," he starts, his tone defensive and strained, "that this court has been complicit in wrongdoing?" The room holds its breath, awaiting the agent's response. One of the agents, the one holding the folder, looks up steadily. "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. The documents speak for themselves." He slides a paper up to Judge Greaves's desk, the action deliberate and unnerving. The judge's eyes flit down reluctantly, scanning the page. Whatever he sees causes a flicker of something almost imperceptible: shock, guilt, rage, to cross his face. The Attorney General's voice cuts through again, leaning into the moment. "It's hard to claim ignorance when it's written in black and white, isn't it?" he asks, his voice quieter now but carrying sharp edges nonetheless. "How much was overlooked, or perhaps ignored?" He lets the question linger as the courtroom grows impossibly still once more. The spectators in the gallery lean forward, craning their necks to catch every nuance of the escalating drama. The prosecutors, now pale and visibly uncomfortable, exchange hushed words, clearly unsettled by the sudden shift in focus. The once confident lead prosecutor fumbles slightly as he adjusts the papers in front of him, his authority in the room now undermined by a wave of doubt. Suddenly, one of the federal agents, reaching deeper into the folder, retrieves another document, holding it for Judge Greaves to see. "This," the agent states firmly, "is evidence of witness tampering during the initial stages of this investigation. Names have been redacted for now, but rest assured, Your Honor, these instances are no small matter." The gallery erupts into low but urgent whispers, and the sound builds as though the courtroom itself is reacting to the revelation. Greaves exhales sharply, the weight of the moment pressing visibly on his shoulders. His jaw works in silence for several seconds, clenching and unclenching, before he forces himself to respond. "I will remind everyone," he begins carefully, "that hearsay and premature judgment have no place in these proceedings." The statement feels weak, leaning on a legal technicality to counteract the moral indictment hanging in the air. It's clear that even he doesn't entirely believe his own words. Another interruption splits the scene. A loud vibration carried through the courtroom originates from the front podium. Someone's phone, likely the clerk's. Nervous fumbling follows, but all eyes turn to the young man, who hastily silences the device and mutters an apology. Still, the interruption serves as an uneasy omen. The courtroom is a charged powder keg, susceptible to any spark. The Attorney General steps forward slightly, his back impossibly straight, his gaze narrowed to a point of rhetorical impact. "For years, people like me have been asked to rely on the system to provide fairness, to trust that justice will prevail. Today, we're seeing why that trust is not only misplaced, but weaponized against us. You wanted to make an example of me. He pauses, his eyes scanning the room slowly. Instead, you've made an example of yourselves. A ripple of gasps moves through the spectators like falling dominoes, some stifled while others are outright audible. In that moment, he appears larger than life, not just a man defending himself, but an icon of an ideology too long ignored. Before anyone can regain control of the escalating energy, an officer stationed near the courtroom's entrance moves swiftly toward the door. The action draws curious eyes from the audience, and their whispers grow louder, layered with escalating anxiety. The officer leans against the door, pressing an earpiece closer as if listening to something urgent. His expression changes, hardening, and then with a sharp, declarative voice, loud enough to be heard by all. Your Honor, the U.S. Attorney General's office has issued an external briefing. Media outlets outside the courthouse are broadcasting live. This trial is now a matter of national interest. Judge Greaves's face flushes with color, his carefully crafted image of control continuing to crumble under the weight of external pressure. The Attorney General, however, remains impassive, his focus trained on the judge like a hunter lining up a final shot. National interest? The judge repeats, his voice faltering. The words hang there, vulnerable, exposed. The singular thread holding his authority together visibly unravels. The Attorney General smiles faintly, a thin, knowing smile of a man prepared for every eventuality. Like I said, he murmurs just loud enough for the room to hear, "This isn't over." The federal agents stood stoic, their presence solidifying the shift in dynamics of the room. The once commanding Judge Greaves, a figure under scrutiny, continued to grip the edge of his bench, the trembling of his fingers a betrayal of his thundering gavel earlier. The collective tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Now it was not solely about the case against the Attorney General, but an unraveling truth that seemed to implicate everyone who had held power over this trial. The gallery sat buzzing with hushed whispers. Some leaned in to murmur theories to each other about what the agents might have uncovered. Others watched in stunned silence, their gazes darting between the judge and defendant. History was unfolding before their eyes, and none dared look away. Even the court reporter had stopped documenting, frozen in awe of the raw drama spilling out before them. The taller of the federal agents handed the second document, just as damning as the first, to Judge Greaves. Evidence of gross malpractice during the arrest phase, he explained, his voice calm but resolute. Unlawful detainment, suppression of exculpatory evidence, and strategic omissions in the prosecution's statements. This wasn't just a botched procedural error, this was systemic. Judge Greaves's eyes flickered over the document, the deep furrow of his brow revealing his internal turmoil. The sweat collecting at his temples said what his courtroom bluster could not. This wasn't just about this trial, it was about his courtroom. Everything he'd presided over, every judgment he had issued, was suddenly under the harsh fluorescent light of scrutiny. The Attorney General watched intently, the slight rise of his eyebrow the only expression betraying his emotions. But he didn't speak, not yet. The quiet was deliberate, letting the weight of the federal agent's words hang in the air like a storm cloud drawing ever closer. The prosecutor rose suddenly, his chair screeching loudly against the tiled floor. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rising above the murmurs. The attempt at reclaiming control only made him sound desperate. "I must object to the direction this has taken. These agents are overstepping their bounds. This trial concerns obstruction of justice, not allegations against investigators. To continue this way undermines the sanctity of our legal process." The Attorney General smirked faintly but remained silent. One of the federal agents leveled the prosecutor with a steady gaze. "The sanctity you speak of," he said evenly, "has been compromised by your actions and the actions of others tied to this case." His words ignited murmurs of agreement from parts of the gallery. It was clear that the prosecutor's authority was just as fragmented as that of the judge. Judge Greaves shifted in his chair, visibly caught between his allegiance to the system and the mountain of evidence being stacked against it. The gavel sat too far out of reach, as though some part of him knew that further attempts at asserting control would only erode his credibility. His lips parted as if about to speak, but were interrupted by the Attorney General's voice sliding into the moment, smooth and commanding. "This trial is no longer about me," he said, his voice low but loud enough to cut through the unrest. Each pause felt intentional, pulling attention back to him like gravity. It hasn't been since the moment I walked into this courtroom. It's about a system that doesn't ask for justice, it demands submission. And when that isn't given, as in my case, it twists the narrative until the truth is unrecognizable. The judge slammed his hand, not the gavel, but his bare palm onto the bench. Its hollow thud surprised even him. "Enough," he growled, though the edge of authority he intended wasn't there. "This courtroom does not entertain sensationalism." "No," the Attorney General said, taking a step forward, his movements deliberate but unthreatening. "You've entertained something far worse: complicity, silence, and inequality. And now, the world is watching." The gallery erupted into fervent chatter, reporters visibly typing in a frenzy, but their noise faded into the background as a court officer entered from the back, his face tight with urgency. His appearance created an immediate ripple of unease. "Your Honor," the officer called out, stepping forward and speaking low enough that the gallery only caught portions of his next words. "Crowd, outside the courthouse. Media vans arriving, building security requested." Judge Greaves tangled his hands together as though trying to physically steady himself. This moment, with its growing consequences outside these courtroom walls, was shaping up to be more than he'd ever anticipated. "Is it contained?" he asked sharply, though everyone present heard the faint tremor in his tone. "Barely," the officer replied, before exchanging uneasy glances with one of the federal agents, who nodded grimly. The Attorney General exhaled slowly, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "The truth, Your Honor, doesn't stay contained." The judge turned to face him, his expression caught between anger and recognition of the inevitability of the situation. But before he could gather a response, a loud thud resonated through the walls of the courtroom, causing everyone to jerk their heads toward the source. It wasn't close enough to provoke panic, but deliberate enough, a final punctuation to an already unraveling day. "We live in truth or we live in fear," the Attorney General said quietly, still addressing the judge. "The decision, Your Honor, is yours." And in the charged silence that followed, the faint sound of chanting began to seep into the courtroom from outside. The crowd gathered beyond the courthouse walls was growing louder, their voices echoing the themes of injustice now spilling over into the nation's consciousness. And inside, all anyone could do was wait for Judge Greaves's next move and stretch their nerves against whatever impossible force was coming next. The courtroom seems to pulse with an unidentifiable energy, as if the very room reacts to the slow, methodical spiral of control slipping from Judge Greaves's grasp. All heads have turned again to the front doors, where faint echoes of protest and chanting seep through the cracks. They are growing louder, more urgent, a rising wave of collective anger and anticipation from those gathered beyond. Whatever was confined to the courtroom has now spilled into the streets, into the consciousness of a waiting nation. Greaves leans back slightly, his chair creaking under the weight of his shifting authority. His mind races, although his composed demeanor does its best to shield his desperation from the room. But every whispered word from the gallery, every sharpened glance from the Attorney General, and every shuffled page from the federal agents feels like another stone added to the scale already tipping against him. "Agent," Greaves finally says, his voice finding a sliver of its former command, though it sounds brittle at the edges. "Is this additional material relevant to the trial at hand, or a distraction from the charges being deliberated in this court?" His attempt to reassert dominance rings hollow and overly formal, like a man clutching for an anchor that has long since been pulled away. The taller agent, still reviewing documents with calculated patience pauses, raises his eyes to meet the judge's gaze and replies, his tone measured yet unyielding. "Your Honor, as stated before, these materials are not extraneous." He hesitates briefly, as if deciding whether to continue. "They reveal active, systemic misconduct within the prosecution's team and investigating authorities involved in this case. Frankly, what's documented here calls into question not just this trial, but whether this courtroom has functioned within the parameters of justice." This lands like a thunderclap, the agent's composed voice doing nothing to soften the piercing effect of his words. A quiet chaos erupts in the gallery. Whispers build into a crescendo of conspiracy theories, disbelief, and mounting anger at the broken system unraveling before their eyes. The lead prosecutor visibly stiffens, a bead of sweat betraying him as it slides down his temple. He tries to protest but falters, caught in the gravity of the agent's accusation. The Attorney General doesn't allow the moment to pass unremarked. From his place, he steps forward ever so slightly, directed not at the agent but squarely at Judge Greaves. "You've heard the evidence. You've seen what's before you." His voice sharpens, each word delivered with the precision of a chisel against stone. "Is this the part where you reach for your gavel, call for recess, and hope this storm passes you by unseen and unscathed? Or can we finally hear you admit the truth?" Greaves's eyes flicker briefly to the gavel resting innocuously on his desk. Its polished handle gleams under the fluorescence, a cruel reminder of the power it symbolizes. But his hand doesn't move, though his expression tightens. "Careful, defendant," he seethes, the words carrying only a shadow of their intended threat. "You've made your point. Don't overstep." "Overstep?" The Attorney General's laugh is bitter, hollow, cutting. "The irony coming from you. I have overstepped nothing. What I've done is expose the cracks in the system you've spent years upholding with nothing more than your pride and prejudice." His words ignite the gallery once more, some voices murmuring their approval while others simply gawk at his audacity. Judge Greaves slams his palm down on the bench again, the sound reverberating through the room but accomplishing little where authority is concerned. "This rabble will cease," he declares, his voice raising higher than necessary, straining to re-establish some semblance of control. "Order must be maintained." Yet the room ignores him, attention splintering as the chanting outside grows thunderous, a tide crashing closer with every second. Their words become clear now, a chant repeated with deliberate conviction. "Justice for all! Justice for all!" It hits the courtroom like a shockwave, the demand echoing louder with every passing moment. The shorter federal agent steps forward this time, his demeanor calm but his voice firm. "Your Honor," he says, "we recommend immediate deliberation. These developments require judicial review beyond this trial to address broader implications of misconduct." Before the judge can respond, the chamber doors swing open once again, this time forcefully, slamming against the walls and cutting the tension with sheer physicality. A tall man in a dark suit strides in, his presence commanding immediate attention. The room falls silent the way prey does under the gaze of a predator. He's holding yet another folder, his gaze sharp enough to break through the courtroom's oppressive fog. "Director Avery, Department of Justice," the man announces calmly, his voice carrying the weight to silence even the most boisterous whispers. He strides past the gallery and stops directly before Judge Greaves's bench, placing the folder down with an audible thud. "You'll want to see this." The silence following his words is deafening. Greaves hesitates, then picks up the folder with visible trepidation. Eyes throughout the courtroom are glued to him as he flips through its contents. His face, already strained, slackens visibly, his lips parting as he scans the pages. The Attorney General watches him intently, his expression unreadable but his posture radiating calm command. "It's all there, isn't it?" he says, his tone almost gentle, but the undercurrent of triumph is impossible to miss. Every act of willful blindness, every choice that prioritized convenience over conscience. Judge Greaves says nothing, his ordinarily formidable gaze fixed on the folder's damning pages. And then, the faintest sound of footsteps outside grabs everyone's attention. These are not the hurried movements of a messenger or officer, but the disciplined march of an advancing force. It's followed by the unmistakable static crackle of a megaphone. "Attention!" A voice booms from outside, its amplified sound cutting through even the courtroom's thick walls. "By order of federal mandate, this building is now under lockdown until further notice. All staff and present parties are to remain in place." The declaration hits the room like a final nail in the coffin. Shockwaves ripple among the reporters, the attorneys, and even the federal agents. Judge Greaves's hands tighten on the edge of his bench as he looks up, his eyes darkened with the weight of his crumbling dominion. The Attorney General remains still, though one corner of his mouth curls upward. "Looks like the tide just turned," he murmurs, his voice low but certain enough to cut through the crackling tension. "Shall we proceed?" The courtroom crackles with a blend of apprehension and disbelief, the air so heavy with uncertainty that every breath feels audible. Outside, the chants of the protesters continue, their voices growing more synchronized, more powerful. "Justice for all! Justice for all!" The sound creeps into the courtroom like an unwelcome guest, tightening the tension within. Each syllable seems to tug harder on the judge's weakening composure. Judge Greaves sits motionless, his stiff posture now merely an attempt to project control he no longer has. His eyes flicker down to the folder on his desk, its damning contents heavier than the physical weight of paper and ink. He hasn't dared lift the gavel again. its authority now rendered meaningless by the cascading accusations, the federal agents, and the roaring storm of public interest swelling just outside. From his position, the Attorney General stands unmoved, but it's clear his presence is no longer simply a defense against the charges levied against him. He is defiance personified, daring not just the judge, but the entire broken facade of the system they all claim to serve, to reckon with truths long ignored. His gaze stays fixed on the judge, like an archer keeping his target in sight. Director Avery, the man who only moments ago swept into the courtroom with an air of absolute command, leans slightly toward the judge. His voice is low enough to avoid broadcasting the specifics to the gallery, but carries a weight that arches every listening ear. Your Honor, the materials we have uncovered prove systemic corruption, reaching beyond this trial. Federal audits and external oversight are no longer a question, they're imminent. You can cooperate, or you can escalate the situation. The choice is yours. The judge feels the weight in those words as if they were spoken directly to the hollow of his chest. The chants outside grow louder. They're no longer a distant hum, but a rhythmic thunder that presses against the courtroom's thick walls like an advancing army. He adjusts his robe, a conscious movement, to stall as he grapples with decisions he never once believed he would face. Your Honor! The lead prosecutor, pale and desperate, steps forward yet again, his voice rising in an attempt to counter the room's shifting tide. These distractions are irrelevant. The matter before this court is an obstruction by the defendant. He is on trial, not the system. His emphasis on defendant lands like a clenched fist, but it rings hollow, the sound swallowed by the gallery's skeptical murmurs. The Attorney General tilts his head ever so slightly, exuding calm but laced with a razor-sharp focus meant to terrify his opponents. Fascinating, is it not? How swiftly the prosecution accuses me of deflecting while scrambling so hard to do the same? His voice cuts like a scalpel, sharp and deliberate, made for maximum effect. His focus shifts from the judge to the prosecutor. Tell me, counselor, would these so-called distractions include the material evidence you conveniently suppressed from view? Or perhaps the manufactured testimony tailored to fit your narrative? The prosecutor freezes, his lips parting for a retort that never comes. Instead, he casts an uneasy look toward the federal agents, both of whom are now openly inspecting him, their expressions carefully neutral, but their scrutiny unmistakable. The gallery hums again, agitation bubbling under the surface. Before anyone can address the tension, a new development commands the room. The faint crackle of a megaphone from outside, now entirely distinct. The voice that follows booms with clarity, cutting through the thick occult of judicial drama inside. By order of federal mandate, additional investigative teams are being deployed. This courthouse is required to cooperate fully. All individuals are advised to remain in their positions until further instructions. The crowd murmurs and shifts audibly, a restless wave of disbelief and curiosity rippling through the gallery. Cameras from the press section flash, their operators scrambling to catch every flicker of expression on the faces of those in power. Even the court stenographer has halted, her fingers poised above the keys, momentarily paralyzed by the enormity of the situation. Judge Greaves looks toward the courtroom doors, his world collapsing in on him one revelation at a time. He's still clinging to his authority like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. His voice cracks before he regains himself, this court will not be dictated by forces outside its purview. The words might have struck fear just hours earlier. Now they seem impotent, a final persuasion of a defeated figure propped against traditions long expired. For the first time, Director Avery speaks directly to the room's spectators, his voice steady, commanding. To everyone present, remain seated. This trial has escalated to include a broader federal inquiry. Transparency concerning these allegations of misconduct will follow immediately. His tone offers no room for discussion, silencing even the faintest whispers. The Attorney General speaks suddenly, his voice a quiet storm but cutting through the silence. Justice, Your Honor, he murmurs softly as though testing the weight of the term. He steps forward, a controlled but deliberate movement that draws every gaze in the room to him. Justice is not what this courtroom has dealt in for years, is it? His eyes find the judges, pressing onward with unrelenting focus. It's been bartered, twisted, withheld, and in my case, weaponized. Another gasp ripples through the room. Heads turn toward Judge Greaves, who looks caught in a silent war between his hammer of authority and the crushing weight of implications around him. Before the moment can be resolved, there's a loud knock at the courtroom doors, so deliberate and forceful that it sets hearts leaping into throats. Everyone turns, breaths held, as if the door itself might detonate when opened. A bailiff strides cautiously toward the door, his trepidation evident. The knocks come again, pounding louder than the first, and as the bailiff reaches for the handle, the Attorney General breaks the silence one last time. "There's the sound of inevitability, Your Honor." Judge Greaves's chest tightens, his pulse hammering like a drumbeat of dread. And then, with a slow, thunderous creak, the doors swing open. The courtroom had grown into a swirling vortex of confusion, anticipation, and quiet terror. Though the environment still adhered to the routines of judicial decorum, whispered exchanges, the scratching of pens on paper, the judge's slightly trembling gavel between moments of silence, the chaos that lay just outside those thick wooden doors was seeping in, its pressure building endlessly. Every individual within those walls now felt it, like an invisible hand wrapped tightly around their backs, prodding them to face the inevitable tide about to crash down. Judge Martin Greaves, usually so unflappable, now had the hollow look of a man cornered by forces he couldn't master. The chants from outside the courthouse, "Justice for all! Justice for all!" punished his ears with their repetition, a chant that grew deafening in his head even as he pretended to ignore it. His fingers hovered over the folder handed to him by Director Avery, its pages filled with evidence of corruption, misconduct, and failures that ripped at the foundation of the judicial system he governed. Every page carried another weight, another crack in the armor of his authority, yet he couldn't bring himself to truly absorb the contents. To do so would be to acknowledge what this courtroom had become, a stage for power imbalance disguised as impartiality. The Attorney General, still in his position at the defendants' table, stood with a quiet gravity that drew every gaze and suspicion in the room. Unlike the judge, who seemed to shrink under the pressure, he had grown bolder, more authoritative with every passing moment of truth spilling into the open. His words lingered in the air even when he fell silent, like ripples in a pond that refused to settle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he finally said, breaking the eerie quiet that had draped itself over the spectators. He was no longer speaking to just the judge or the prosecutors. The room, as one, had become his audience. What you see here isn't just about a single defendant on trial. It isn't just about obstruction charges or questions of guilt and innocence. It's about a justice system built on the illusion of fairness, a system that thrives on the power to decide who matters and who does not. Heads turned as he spoke, his words resonating even with those predisposed against him. Reporters furiously scribbled, capturing his phraseology, while even the bailiffs exchanged uncertain glances. For all the procedural training they'd received, this trial was not one they could have possibly anticipated. The lead prosecutor broke the spell, rising abruptly from his chair and striking the table before him with an audible thud. "Your Honor," he barked, his voice wavering slightly despite his intentions. "This is grandstanding and insult to the sanctity of this courtroom. I demand that we return to the matter at hand. Theatrics from the defendant should—" "It's not theatrics when lives are at stake," the Attorney General interrupted, his calm voice cutting through the prosecutor's exuberance in an instant. The power shifted back to him effortlessly. "This room, your strategies, your manipulation of truth is exactly why the sanctity you speak of means nothing to the public anymore." Judge Greaves rubbed at his temples, but refused to look up as the argument unfolded before him. He held his gavel but knew better than to strike it again. It had failed him each time before. Instead, he finally glanced at Director Avery, hoping for an opening to regain control. But there was no lifeline present in the sharp, calculating gaze of the federal official. If anything, he seemed to be waiting for the judge to falter further. Outside, the chants shifted, synchronizing into something rawer, more resonant. "Tear it down! Tear it down!" The rhythm of the voices acted as feet marching upon the courthouse itself, making the walls vibrate with the demands of a nation watching from beyond. The gallery, unable to completely tune out the noise now, sat anxious and transfixed, each spectator aware they were trapped in one of those rare moments where history as it truly is, messy, painful, and unresolved, was being broadcast live. The tension doubled when the side door to the courtroom squeaked open once again. Yet another officer entered, but this one had an unusual urgency in his stride. Reaching the judge's bench, he leaned in close enough to whisper into Greaves's ear. Though nobody else could hear what he said, the judge's face betrayed everything: fear, uncertainty, and most damning of all, the struggle of a man whose decisions were now fully outpaced by events beyond his control. The Attorney General didn't let the vulnerability go unnoticed. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands lightly on the defendant's table, as though preparing to deliver the final blow. Something about the confidence in his demeanor unnerved the prosecution, stilled even the most experienced journalists. "The truth has a funny way of catching up with us all," he said, and once again his tone was not angry but purposeful, a declaration instead of a threat. "Your Honor," Director Avery interjected for the first time since his ominous arrival, his voice startlingly measured, "the investigation will continue regardless of what happens here today. Dismissing or delaying further examination of the defendant's case will not stop what's coming." Greaves finally raised his eyes, pale but flaring with what little pride he had left. "You walk into my courtroom and undermine its authority while protesters bang on its walls." "Don't lecture me, Director," he growled weakly. "This court does not bow to outside pressure." "It doesn't bow, perhaps," the Attorney General said in a tone that sounded almost contemplative, yet cutting sharp. His eyes narrowed. "But it breaks just as it has for years under the weight of its own corruption." Suddenly, the loud echo of something metallic scraping against a microphone pierced through the courtroom walls, followed by a voice amplified from outside. "Attention! Media briefing in 10 minutes. Federal oversight teams are stepping in. Public disclosure immediate. Stand by for updates." The announcement, well-phrased and surgically delivered, erased what little illusion remained of Judge Greaves's authority. He knew now there was no stalling, no suppressing. The courtroom wasn't just a room anymore, it was a stage for a reckoning that no gavel strike could stop. "Proceed," whispered the Attorney General. The courtroom holds its collective breath in that unending silence, a crescendo building just behind the facade of rigid discipline. The doors have swung wide open, but the figure that lingers in the threshold is not the chaos they expected. Not there yet. In walks a solitary woman dressed sharply in black, a briefcase clenched tight at her side. Her heels click against the floor, each step reverberating like a ticking time bomb. She does not waver. Her eyes fix immediately on Judge Greaves, cutting through the room and every layer of tension that stifled it. "Your Honor," she finally speaks, her voice carrying a gravity even those at the far end of the gallery can feel. "I am Special Counsel Rachel Morrell of the Justice Department. Due to recent developments both inside and outside this courthouse, I have been dispatched as an interim legal overseer." The gallery erupts into whispers. Spectators lean toward one another, their murmurs barely disguised attempts to comprehend just how the tide of this trial has shifted yet again. And it has shifted, there's no denying that. Her presence might not appear as dramatic as the chanting throng outside or the federal agents pacing at Greaves's side, but to those versed in judicial power struggles, her arrival is seismic. The prosecutor visibly stiffens, his knuckles pressing against the table in irritation thinly veiled by panic. "Your Honor," he begins with far less confidence than before, "this is highly irregular. The oversight of this case does not fall under the purview of internal review. Objection on the grounds of jurisdiction." Special Counsel Morrell raises an eyebrow, scanning the room in a single sweeping motion before returning her unimpressed gaze to the prosecutor. Jurisdiction on this case shifted the moment federal impropriety surfaced. Her words are a cold, clinical dismantling of his argument. Objections will be noted, but serve no purpose. We are here to address the truth, not the remnants of a collapsing narrative. Turning back toward the bench, her tone softens, but only slightly. "I trust you understand this, Your Honor." Judge Greaves sits absolutely still, his mind screaming for control that his body refuses to accompany anymore. He can feel the scrutiny of the gallery burning into his back, the chants from outside growing louder. If there is a moment to assert himself as the figure upon which the collective weight of justice rests, this is it. But his mouth goes dry as he contemplates how, if at all, this can be salvaged. In the gallery, the Attorney General observes with the precision of a sculptor scanning his nearly finished work. His hands clasped together, not in triumph or anticipation, but with a calculated sense of inevitability. This, after all, was never his wreckage to salvage, only to endure long enough for it to implode under the force of its truth. And now, that moment unfolds. Judge Greaves clears his throat, addressing Special Counsel Morrell while attempting to ignore the weight of everything that surrounds them. "Ms. Morrell, this courtroom is still under my jurisdiction until further notice. Whatever information brought you here can be processed after the proceedings conclude. I presume you and your office recognize that law and order cannot function under brute spectacle. Morel smirks faintly, her hand resting calmly on the edge of her briefcase. Justice, she replies with surgical calm, is not a spectacle, Your Honor. Ignoring it, however, certainly qualifies. Ripples of murmurs course through the gallery again. The room now feels alive, buzzing with anticipation while ticking ever closer to an invisible detonation. The prosecutor, clearly rattled, whispers anxiously to his team, though no one looks capable of offering valid counterpoints anymore. Suddenly, the voice of Director Avery slices through the room again. "Forgive me," he says, his tone deliberately void of emotion as though reading statistics off a page. But the Department of Justice requires clarity. Is this court prepared to acknowledge that the defendant's case has now become irrevocably tied to systemic concerns? Judge Greaves falters visibly this time. His voice is faint as he stammers, trying to both respond and evade. This trial concerns charges of obstruction against an individual who was set up by the same system accusing him, the Attorney General interjects, his words punching through every desperate attempt at deflection. He stands from his chair slowly, deliberately. His gaze never leaves Judge Greaves. Answer the question, Your Honor. Or are you only capable of answers that end in condemnations? Beginnings you seem to have no grasp of. And there it is again. That heavy pulse of silence before the room explodes into chaos. Reporters nearly leap out of their seats as cameras flash and hands scribble furiously, capturing every nuance of the escalating momentum. The gallery buzzes loudly, spilling over with commentary, murmurs, barely hidden outrage as the unconventional trial edges closer to a full theatrical unraveling. But it isn't over yet. With a deliberate thud, Morel places her briefcase on the desk in front of her. She unzips it methodically, her every move conspicuous enough to make Greaves nearly squirm under its slow reveal. Finally, she pulls out a sealed envelope stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the Department of Justice. She slides the envelope toward Greaves without a word, the gesture heavy with implications. For a moment, Greaves only stares, the envelope somehow taunting him. Whatever this represents, it's the final strain against his tenuous grip on the reins of this courtroom. "You should read it," she advises. Her voice is soft this time, but possesses a confidence that suggests she already knows how this plays out. A loud knock, this time from within the main courtroom doors, interrupts before Judge Greaves can reach for the envelope. All heads turn again. Guards move toward the sound, and the murmurs in the gallery rise as their restlessness spreads. Click. The doors creak open again, revealing multiple figures stepping through at once, uniforms distinctly federal. And in their center stands a woman holding a microphone connected to no amplification system within the courtroom, but faintly emitting that unmistakable, mic-ready hum. She lifts it gently, prepared to speak. Grinds to a halt. The gallery freezes, and at the head of the room, Judge Greaves stares down the hallway between his illusions of calm and the approaching certainty of collapse. The courtroom, now transformed into a boiling crucible of legal drama, feels almost unbearably tense. With every passing moment, the walls solid and lined with history seem to confine rather than ground the unfolding spectacle. If this was once merely a trial meant to reaffirm law and order, it now unravels as a public reckoning exposing the very system at its heart. The figures of authority, particularly Judge Greaves, look visibly diminished in the simmering heat of scrutiny. Judge Greaves shifts in his chair, his gavel lying unused before him as though it were made of lead. The lines on his face have deepened, betraying a man straining to maintain a precarious hold on power. With the arrival of Special Counsel Morel and the escalating federal presence, the boundaries of his jurisdiction have become frustratingly blurred. He glances again at the sealed envelope in front of him. Its contents a quiet promise of accountability, a damning specter wandering into his courtroom uninvited. Outside, the chants from the gathered protesters grow louder still, more unified, the energy of the crowd pressing in rhythmically against the courtroom doors. The gallery within, restless and alive with whispered theories, reflects the chaos beyond the walls. Reporters feverishly scribble notes, sensing they are documenting something that will ripple far beyond the confines of this trial. Among them, activists nod gravely, their lips tight but their eyes blazing with purpose. Amid it all, the Attorney General stands resolute, exuding an aura of quiet certainty that commands attention. He remains a statue of defiance, as steady as the storm outside is loud. He said little during special counsel Morell's arrival, instead letting each revelation churn the pot further. His silence spoke volumes. Now the room waits, teetering on the edge of its collective seat as though his mere presence dictates where gravity falls. Finally, Judge Greaves clears his throat, the sound breaking like glass in the heavy silence. His voice emerges strained, weighed down not by principle but by pressure. He directs his weary gaze toward Morell, but makes sure it sweeps across the entire room, a last salvage attempt at commanding the moment. Ms. Morell, he begins with what little authority remains. This court's impartiality is not subject to the whims of public outrage or sudden federal interference. Whatever oversight is deemed necessary here will be handled according to proper channels. But if the words are meant to stabilize the room, they fail utterly. The gallery murmurs louder, knowing deflection when they hear it. Morell, unfazed, steps closer to the bench, her presence as sharp and cutting as her every word. "Your Honor," she responds, her voice clinical yet resounding with finality. "This court's impartiality is precisely what has fallen into question. You've presided over these proceedings, knowing that essential pieces of evidence were maliciously withheld. That's not impartiality, that's complicity." Her words land like a hammer on fragile porcelain, and whatever layers of self-assurance Judge Greaves clutches to begin to crack. His fingers tremble slightly as he straightens his back, attempting to summon a facade of indignation. "This territory," he retorts, though his voice falters just slightly, "borders on defamation, counsel. I caution you to tread carefully." The Attorney General steps forward, his motion slow, deliberate, yet commanding. All eyes shift to him instantly. "Treading carefully," he says, his rich voice filled not with anger, but a dangerous calm, "is what brought us to this brink in the first place. Haven't we spent decades treading carefully, Your Honor, silencing victims with the weight of procedure, ignoring misconduct as a procedural oversight? Where has that brought us? Where has that brought you?" Judge Greaves's eyes narrow at the question, but before he can form an answer, the gallery bursts into low gasps. From outside, the pounding of fists against the courthouse doors becomes audible over the still chanting crowd. It's a sound not of rage, but of insistence, of inevitability, footsteps quickening toward a climax everyone can feel creeping towards them. The pressure in the room climaxes as if the sheer will of the public demands to be let in. Director Avery leans forward now, catching Judge Greaves's attention with an expression that is equal parts command and urgency. The room feels like it's vibrating now, both from the pounding chant outside and the weight of everything that has been revealed. Within these walls, heavy with the pretense of order, Judge Greaves sits trapped, less a pillar of authority and more a man reduced by forces far beyond his control. The courthouse has become a pressure cooker, the people outside the doors demanding justice, the figures of power inside struggling to maintain their grip, all while the cracks in the system widen for everyone to see. Judge Greaves, hands clasped tightly together, glances toward Special Counsel Morell. She's unrelenting, her sharp gaze boring into him like she's daring him to make a move. He knows whatever remains of this trial's authority doesn't rest in his gavel anymore. It's been shaken loose, slipping like sand through his fingers. But Greaves isn't the kind of man to crumble entirely. Not yet. His pride claws for purchase even as the ground beneath begins to erode. "Let me make one thing vividly clear," he begins, voice brittle yet straining for strength. "This is my courtroom. My authority." His words are met with hollow silence, carrying no weight in a room where his command is visibly unraveling. Even the reporters, usually diligent in their quiet acknowledgement of decorum, exchange quick glances as though silently acknowledging this man might finally be reaching his breaking point. It's the Attorney General who breaks the silence, his calm voice slicing through the tension with surgical precision. "Authority seated on the throne of denial is no authority at all," he states plainly. His tone is even, measured, not mocking, but calculated to further chip away at the foundation Greaves clings to. Slowly he turns, addressing the gallery, the agents, even the murmurs emanating through the court itself. "We have spent our lives in rooms like this one, watching as power silences truth, as the innocent are devoured by systems too broken to care. But this time, the truth is making itself heard. Outside, the chant rises louder, the crowd's unified roar a spine-tingling pulse that presses harder against the doors. Tear it down! Tear it down! The walls feel thinner now, barely capable of muting the voices screaming for accountability, for justice. Special Counsel Morell steps forward once again, calm in her movements, her presence sharp as broken glass. "Your Honor," she says, her tone devoid of emotion yet laced with the piercing authority someone like Greaves recognizes. "There will be accountability here whether or not you choose to command it. You're no longer deciding the terms of this courtroom. You're deciding where you stand on the right side of history." Whatever control Greaves had been trying to tether to his chest begins to slip completely. His grip tightens on the edge of his bench, his lips pressing into a thin line as his body betrays him with visible tension. "The law has rules," he begins, faltering when Morell cuts him off. "And so do conscience and integrity," she says with quiet force. "So far they seem absent here." For all the tumult, the Attorney General says nothing. He simply watches, standing isolated yet towering, his gaze unflinching. He doesn't interrupt, not yet, but his silence radiates with intention, as though keeping his words held in reserve for when the room least expects them. And then, it happens. The pounding on the courthouse doors finally stops. The silence that replaces it strikes the courtroom like a thunderclap, unnerving everyone in the gallery and pulling their attention to the threshold. No one moves for a moment, not even the guards visibly stationed near the entrance. Judge Greaves visibly exhales a breath he had been holding, though his body remains tense. But the silence is short-lived. The locks on the courthouse doors click loudly in succession, the metallic sound sending shockwaves through the room. Both sets of doors push open, and for a moment, the blaring light of media cameras outside floods the courtroom aisle. Figures begin stepping inside. Throng of federal officials, led by a woman flanked by 2 agents. She wears a tailored suit, a badge prominently displayed at her chest. In her hand is a small binder, held like a weapon of its own. "Ma'am," speaks one of the agents definitively as they approach Special Counsel Morell, greeting her before refocusing their attention on the judge. The strangers exude calm authority, but their grave expressions speak of immediate intent. "I am Samantha Rhodes," begins the suited woman as she faces the bench, her voice carrying over the deadened noise of the courtroom. "Deputy Director of External Investigations Federal Oversight Division. I've been sent here to secure the court's adherence to federal protocols in light of the discoveries within this case." Her words thrum through the room like a stone dropped into still water, reverberating all around. By now, the gallery is alive with activity. Reporters refuse to miss a single moment, proving once again how far beyond a trial this situation has grown. Activists huddle closer together, some openly recording the scene despite the guards' attempts to maintain order. Judge Greaves adjusts his posture, though he no longer commands the same dominance he once did from that very bench. "This courtroom is under local jurisdiction," he says, though the bite is gone from his voice. "Not one to be co-opted by federal theater." Rhodes allows a faint, humorless smile to form on her lips, but doesn't relent. "Your Honor," she rejoins smoothly, "as of this moment, jurisdiction has shifted. With ongoing evidence of systemic graft implicating members of the judiciary, this trial's significance extends far beyond your courtroom." She gestures briefly toward the Attorney General seated across the courtroom floor. "His case is about more than obstruction. This is proof of the rot at the system's core." The Attorney General finally steps forward again, a quiet ripple of surprise moving through the audience. He's been selectively silent but now chooses his moment to speak. "And what will you tear down, Judge?" he asks softly, but his words are no less devastating for their quiet delivery. "Your pride? This illusion of justice? The sound outside that terrifies you isn't chaos, it's clarity. The thing this system fights hardest to suppress." Before Greaves can respond, the people outside roar once more, their chants carrying one clear message that seems to crystallize in everyone's minds at once. Truth. Absolute truth. The courtroom stands hushed, filled with tension so overwhelming it feels as though the room itself were alive and caught in arrested breath. Outside, the chants of the crowd carry the power of an advancing tide, resonating with relentless unity. Truth. Absolute truth. Those within the towering walls of the courthouse have ceased shifting, talking, or even breathing noticeably, their attention glued to the unfolding scene at the center of this turmoil, a trial that has morphed into something far greater than guilt or innocence. The very concept of justice itself balances precariously on the edge of an unseen knife. Samantha Rhodes, the Deputy Director of External Investigations, remains at the forefront of this moment, her stance commanding yet calm, like a steely guardian of inevitable change. She leaves ample space for the words she has just spoken to settle over the stale air of the room. Proof of the rot at the system's core, she had said, her voice weighted like a verdict unto itself. Every syllable carries with it an unassailable authority that seeps into the walls, almost challenging them to reject her truth. Judge Greaves appears to shrink against the imposing bench where he once reigned supreme. His fingers twitch, hovering indecisively over the sealed envelope Morel had pushed toward him mere minutes ago. Its contents remain a mystery to all but a few, yet the mere existence of what lay within continues to act as the silent narrator of this chaotic scene. Around him, hushed murmurs linger. The gallery exchanges incredulous whispers while the reporters refocus their lenses, torn between details of the immediate story and the expanding chaos outside. The only one who seems to radiate unwavering composure is the defendant, the Attorney General, still towering unbowed amid the shifting tides. Morel steps forward, glancing at the judge. Her voice strikes the balance between firm and clinical, eschewing theatrics for the simple power of truth. Your Honor, the moment has come to stop pretending you're deciding a single man's fate. This trial was always larger than it appeared, but now the evidence speaks plainly for itself. History will judge this moment. The question we're all waiting for is, where will you stand when the verdict reaches you? The judge visibly flinches at the question, his once sharp courtroom eyes failing to meet Morel's steady gaze. Instead, he glances nervously toward Director Avery, whose impassive expression offers neither comfort nor escape. Meanwhile, the prosecutor, shoulders hunched under the weight of circumstances spiraling out of his control, bites his lip in discontent. The crowd outside crescendos in their crieza, roar amplified not just by sound, but by meaning. Every tear it down rattles through the walls like a ghost foretelling the end of an empire. For a fleeting moment, Judge Greaves wonders if they might breach the doors altogether. His thoughts feel muddled, crashing into one another like turbulent waves. Greaves begins, but the words sputter and die. His once certain grasp on rhetoric betrays him. He clears his throat and begins again, his tone brittle, cracking in places even as he fights hard to stabilize it. This court cannot yield to the whims of outrage. The Attorney General steps forward at that exact moment, commanding attention with the tiniest of movements. When he speaks, his voice remains calm, though every word reverberates like distant thunder. And at what point do we acknowledge that what you dismiss as outrage is in fact accountability, Your Honor? He pauses, his gaze scanning the gallery, then locking back on the judge. This isn't about yielding. It's about answering for the choices that have led us here. Choices you made long before I stepped into your courtroom. Judge Greaves bristles visibly at the directness of the remark. He starts to respond, his lips pulling taut to form words, but Rhodes interjects sharply before he can regain his equilibrium. Your Honor, she says firmly, addressing him with precise enunciation, a federal hearing will be convened immediately. Your refusal to engage transparently at this juncture only cements the allegations against not just the defendant, but you and this entire court. There it is, the final push. The moment hangs unbearably heavy, the crackling tension in the air calling forth something primal, inevitable. The gallery is dead silent now, all awaiting the inevitable response from three separate loci of reflected power: Greaves, the defiant Attorney General, and the looming presence of federal authority embodied in Rhodes and Avery. The silence is punctuated by a sound from beyond the courtroom, the unmistakable clang of media barrier rails collapsing, replaced by cries from the protest lines converging closer to the courthouse doors. It sends another jolt rippling across those inside. Yet the true center of their universe remains Judge Greaves, whose trembling hands suddenly reach, slowly, fatally, for the sealed envelope before him. He breaks the seal methodically, the stark sound of tearing paper amplified above the stillness. As he unfolds the document, his eyes scan the pages slowly, draining of color as they absorb line after damning line. The room waits with bated breath as the judge's body stiffens, then sags ever so slightly, his weary expression delivering the first tacit verdict before his mouth even has the courage to form the words. Greaves begins, his voice trembling so softly that one could almost believe he didn't intend to speak at all. I acknowledge. A loud, sharp knock on the doors interrupts him mid-sentence. Murmurs ripple through the room as all heads swivel toward the entrance. The knock comes again, this time more insistent. Eyes dart nervously across the room. From the gallery to the bench, everyone tenses, waiting, as the door slowly swings inward. Beyond the threshold, the glare of live camera lights floods the room, illuminating the grim figure of another federal agent holding yet another sealed file. They hold it high, a silent testament to the still expanding scope of revelations threatening to engulf this trial. Greaves freezes. The final image of a man teetering on the precipice of collapse as a new force steps through the cracks in his defenses, widening them irrevocably. The Attorney General tilts his head and for the first time lets a smile break through. It gleams sharp, knowing. "Shall we proceed?" he asks with deliberate calm, the words falling like another hammer to the fragile remnants of the room's already fractured order. The courtroom was an inferno of scrutiny and judgment with no clear path forward. Every piece of its crumbling integrity lay bare under oppressive fluorescent lights, and for the first time, Judge Greaves's fabled composure was in ruins. He sat in the shadow of his own indecision, with his hands clasping the edges of the bench as though holding on to something slipping away. His authority, his conviction, his control. None could be saved from the relentless march of truth. The federal agents stood like sentinels, stoic and unmoving, while Special Counsel Morell and Deputy Director Rhodes brought their own commanding presence. Both women were firm, unwavering figures in a courtroom that had become a stage for systemic reckoning. Behind them, the air crackled, part tension, part anticipation of fallout no one could avoid. Outside, the chants of the crowd provided a constant, rising drumbeat of urgency. "Justice for all! Justice for all!" It rattled the floor, almost as if the building itself trembled under the weight of collective redemption. Judge Greaves's voice, gruff and cracking, managed a faint objection, though it hardly resonated beyond his own mind. "This is not how it works," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His words fell flat, drowned out by all that had been revealed. The Attorney General, poised and unmoving at his table, tilted his head slightly, his calm cutting through the judge's faltering voice. He raised his arms in a subtle gesture, as if presenting to the gallery the disarray before them. "Do you hear yourself, Your Honor?" He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention in the room. When every barrier of corruption you're desperate to protect crumbles, all you can cling to is the excuse of process that this isn't how things work. But maybe it should be. Maybe this courtroom has never seen a moment closer to actual justice than this very second. A murmur swept through the gallery. Heads nodded, some in solemn consideration, others in whispered agreement. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens frantic to keep up with the unraveling narrative. Even the prosecution team, those once confidently positioned to bury the defendant, now sat rigid as statues, shifting uncomfortably at the accusations they could no longer deflect. Special Counsel Morell stepped closer to the judge's bench and placed her sharp gaze directly upon him. "Withholding the truth at this point will only compound the damage. And by damage it, Your Honor," she added with deliberate weight, "I mean to more than the public's trust. This envelope," she gestured toward its open edges on the bench, "contains official documentation implicating parties within this court. Names, actions, consequences." Morell didn't raise her voice as she spoke, yet her words carried all the force of judgment itself, slicing through the growing clamor inside the room. Around her, even the guards stood straighter, the charged atmosphere forcing everyone into uneasy silence. Judge Greaves avoided her penetrating gaze entirely, staring instead at the damning papers spilled before him. His face was waxy and pallid now, glimmering under harsh court lighting that only seemed to exacerbate the unbecoming flush at his temples. Breathing heavily, his fingers fumbled over the edge of the desk. "What do you want me to do?" The question escaped his lips suddenly, almost involuntarily and louder than he meant. It wasn't the voice of a proud arbiter of justice, but of a battered man struggling to maintain relevance in a world finally unmasking his limitations. The room hung on the fragility of his words. The Attorney General stood now, ironclad control radiating from his unflinching stance. He met Greaves's eyes head-on, tearing through the judge's paper shield of excuses. "I want transparency," he said with methodical clarity. "Not for me, for everyone you've condemned without remorse. For every person erased by the illusion of order." The judge's jaw tightened at the implications, but before he could speak, the courtroom erupted in chaos. The heavy front doors burst wide open, slamming against the adjacent walls, and the sound of the chanting crowd outside surged in. No longer muffled, their demands for truth, absolute truth, filled the court, carrying with them an undeniable authority that transcended those within. The noise surged and ebbed, pressing like ocean waves against the marshaled tension of federal officers rushing to guard the doors. Deputy Director Rhodes raised a hand into the court's thick tension, quieting the growing disorder with an almost preternatural calm. Slowly, she turned her sharp gaze to Judge Greaves, her movements deliberate, measured. This court is rapidly losing what remains of its legitimacy. I suggest we change course now before it's too late. Greaves attempted to stand taller. Don't lecture me, Deputy Director. I'm well aware of this court's status. His voice cracked midway, undermining his effort. But public theatrics do not determine justice. He gestured blindly toward the Attorney General. Neither does disobedience disguised as defiance. You're mistaken again, the Attorney General said, allowing a pause just long enough to let the room hold every syllable to come. Truth determines justice, and your refusal to embrace it is why your authority is in ruins. Before anyone could react, another officer entered briskly from a side door, cutting through the moment like a knife drawn from its sheath. He strode purposefully toward Rhodes, pausing mere feet from the bench. He whispered something short, urgent, and loaded with gravity. Rhodes's face remained unreadable, but her steady nod sent ripples of unease through those watching. The room was deadly quiet again when Rhodes turned back toward Greaves, who now appeared visibly sweating. She spoke slowly, enunciating each word for weight. It seems undeniable evidence of judicial malfeasance directly implicates this court and its presiding official. The judge opened his mouth to respond, perhaps to protest, but his voice faltered, swallowed by the seismic weight bearing down upon him. And in that seemingly endless silence, the Attorney General spoke one final time. Tell me, Your Honor, are you the last line of defense for a lie or the first to reckon with the truth? The thunderous silence that swallowed the courtroom lasted only a moment longer, but it felt eternal. Every pair of eyes bore down on Judge Greaves, watching the tension rise in his shoulders, his chest slightly heaving under the weight of what lay before him. His grip on the edge of the bench tightened, so white-knuckled it seemed he could crush the wood itself. The clicking pads of reporters' pens had stilled entirely, poised mid-air like frozen vignettes of suspense as the gathered waited for the culmination of not just a trial, but of an entire moment in history. Outside, the crowd surged. Their chant of truth, absolute truth, bled further into the room, defined by the rawness of sincerity in their voices. The sound was no longer a distant cry, but now felt like it existed inside the courtroom, ricocheting off the walls and invading even the hidden corners of silence. For every name never uttered, for every story never heard, the chant screamed louder. Special Counsel Morrell stepped aside, signaling for no interruption, her expression an unflinching study of calm. Deputy Director Rhodes remained similarly composed, her folded arms suggesting that the resolve of those questioning authority would not waver an inch. They had initiated an unstoppable cascade of truth. It was merely up to Greaves whether he clung to the shredded remnants of procedural control or acknowledged the tide drowning him. Your Honor, Deputy Director Rhodes's commanding voice finally broke the silence like the crack of a whip, her tone cutting yet composed. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the calls for accountability. With each moment you hesitate, this courtroom edges closer to becoming the definitive symbol of what justice failed to be. But, as your judgment looms, it could also choose to lead. Her words hung heavy and focused, stretching the already fragile tension. Each syllable seemed to strike the heart of Greaves's mental conflict. The Attorney General did not move, despite standing central to the storm's eye. Still composed, still a fortress in stature, he observed every motion, every hesitation, his sharp gaze intensifying the weight Greaves must bear. He did not interrupt but radiated presence. The room wasn't suffocating because of the air or density. It was his sheer defiance and unerring ease amidst chaos that consumed the very breath of authority's folly. Judge Greaves swallowed visibly, his trembling fingers finally retreating from the bench's edge to smooth along his robes. This was no cloak of power anymore. To him it now felt like the ceremonial costume of a bygone monarch seated on a throne they no longer deserved to occupy. For once, his tremor reached his voice, the wavering note undeniable. The defense, he began, but faltered, clearing his throat with forced composure. The defendant will stand for acknowledgement of remaining accusations. There it was, the procedural grasp that offered him some meager purchase. A shred of control, perhaps all he had left. The Attorney General slowly stood, unprompted in any rush, his movement deliberate as always. He tilted his head slightly in silent acknowledgement of the court, the gallery, and even the fraying figure still gripping desperately to the gavel. His presence snapped the barely stable fragility of the courtroom back to attention. "Your Honor," began the Attorney General, his tone far softer than prediction could sense level, yet cutting with conviction. "What remnants of accusations you cling to are not for me." His gesture toward the paperwork sitting discarded by Greaves turned every head briefly before his gaze forced them back. "No, those papers detail who you believed me to be, and that belief brought us here, built from your assumptions, twisted to preserve a cycle that stops with me. Today." Gasps from the gallery rippled tentatively, though subdued as the crowd looked once more to the judge. Even amongst reporters, certainly used to such turns of rhetoric before, they sat nearly pinned in fascination. Proverbial screws turned tighter in synchronized anticipation. "This is not about my innocence," the Attorney General continued, sharp and contemplative, pausing mid-breath for dramatic strike. Lowering his clip, tongue sharp again, "It'd be simplistic explaining survival as guilt's implications opposes equilibrium." His veracity silences all except echoing, public tide erupt distraction beneath. Attendees not knowing surfaces tremble through tension. A plenty beneath rare poetic climax, timing, short-clocked before lancing shocks return explosions.